Well, thank you very much for being here today. I'm Stephen Fagan, the Associate Curator, and as Nicholas said, one of my jobs is to manage our ongoing oral history project. This is a dynamic and ongoing initiative that has captured over 1,200 interviews with people from around the world reflecting on the life, death, and legacy of President Kennedy and the history and culture of the 1960s. If you have memories of that time period of President Kennedy and the day of the assassination, no matter where you were in the world, we'd love for you to be part of this tapestry of living history. If you'd like, you can contact us via our website, jfk.org. If you live in the Dallas area, we can invite you back to the museum for a videotaped interview. If you're from out of town, we can certainly do an interview by the telephone, and you can be part of this collection at the museum. And as Nicholas said, every so often a remarkable storyteller emerges in this project, and we like to bring those individuals back for a living history program so that we can share their story with an audience. And today is no exception. Julian Reed, his career began right out of high school as a reporter for the Fort Worth Press, but very soon he became a public relations executive and enjoyed a long and distinguished career. He was a press aide to Governor Gov Connally at the time of the assassination, and he was traveling with the presidential party in Fort Worth and in Dallas. So we have a very interesting story to share with you today. Please join me in welcoming Julian Reed to share his story. Julian, let's start before the assassination. The first time you worked with Gov Connally was when he ran for governor in 1962. And that was an interesting race for governor. There was, I think, 7 candidates, and one of them was Major General Edwin Walker, a very conservative activist here in Dallas. What did you do for Connally in that 1962 campaign?
Well, I started out along with a team of other people and actually doing a little of everything. I had been involved in a couple of 3 races prior to his, including an upset for Jim Wright that nobody expected us to win. So I'd known him, a little bit, but when he asked me to join his team, I jumped in to do whatever I could. And you mentioned the group we were running against. That also included a sitting governor. A sitting governor, Price Daniel, wanted to run for another term. So all the power structure was in place to continue, what was there. So we had an uphill battle from the start, but we came up with some innovative things that I think you know about.
Yeah, one of them was Coffee with Connally. Tell us about that.
Well, of course, at this time, television was pretty new, and we thought that if people could see Gov Connally, if we could meet him and his family, that they would be captivated. It's not a stretch to say that there are many kinships between him and the picture he presented with John F. Kennedy. In fact, Kennedy appointed him to be Secretary of the Navy. So we came up with the idea of coming up with a series of 5-minute television spots to run early in the morning. You're all familiar with the 5-minute cutaway that the networks do for the local news, at 7:25 or 7:55 or 8:25. Well, we bought the 5-minute segment of the Today Show 3 mornings a week, 7:25 a.m., Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And we created this series of Have Coffee with Connally. And the first one we did was from his home in Fort Worth. And we actually took a remote truck out there to do it live to where we had him and his youngsters, they were all young at that age, had them in pajamas coming down from upstairs. And he's sitting there with Ms. Connally having coffee. So that was the beginning. Well, it caught on because the people got to know him. We started out with a rating of 4%. In fact, we had little buttons made, 4%ers, people who got on board early. And that turned out to be an enormous, powerful vehicle. So anyway, long story short, he won the election and became the governor. That's the background of it. And that was the start of my relationship with him, which embraced my being in Dallas. I worked with him on his second campaign, but this was still his first term of office. He had been elected in the fall of 1962. He took office in January of 1963. So I was close to him. I still represented him with the news media. Having been a journalist myself, I, of course, represented him politically and in media relations. And so when this trip came along, I was involved in the trip, and it was natural that I would be representing him in Dallas. So that's kind of the quick summary of how this got here.
Most people know of Governor Connally because he was wounded in the Kennedy assassination, but you knew a different John Connally. You knew him for over 30 years. You knew his wife, Nellie Connally, for more than 40 years. What were the Connallys like as people?
Wonderful. I can just separate that in one sentence, one word, wonderful. John Connally was a rare combination of personnel traits. First of all, he had a very humble background. He grew up as a farm boy in Southeast Texas. He was always a leader from his early age. He was president of the student body at the University of Texas. That's where he met Nellie Connally. She saw him walking down the sidewalk one day, and she said this in her book, and many times she says, "You know, I saw that best-looking young man I'd ever seen in my life." And I said to myself, he doesn't know that his days are numbered. And they got married, and that was the beginning. And they made a great team, both down to earth, but extremely knowledgeable, both of them caring for people, wonderful personalities. He had an aura about him even after he was holding no public office. I would travel with him around the United States, and anywhere he went, when he walked in a room, he was the magnet of attention. It always occurred. Mrs. Connally was just one of the dearest, sweetest women I've ever known in my life. I was blessed after Governor Connally passed away. I was blessed in helping her do her book and went with her on a book tour all over the United States. And of course, I was very sad to see her pass on. But they were genuine people, no pretenses, but could walk with kings anywhere around the world.
November 1963, the president makes a trip to Texas, San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and then with a planned visit to Austin. Now, the official explanation for that trip was that President Kennedy was coming to Texas to mend some political fences, but you have sort of an insider story. What is the truth?
Well, you're right. That was the general story, and the Kennedy people had been very successful in getting that line pretty well out there. The truth of the matter is that they came to Texas primarily for Texas money. Ever since they were elected, the Kennedy group and Governor and President Kennedy had wanted to come to Texas. He was captivated by what he considered those rich Texans. And he had been all over the Vice President, Johnson, to come down here and raise money from the beginning. He wanted to come to Texas and get some of this Texan money. Well, Governor Connally had just been elected governor, as I told you. He was in his first political session in 1963. He had that on his plate. He was really not in a position to do this. Also at that time, the president was not all that popular in Texas. So he had to figure out how he could present him. He wanted to help him, but to present him best. So they kept stalling. He and the vice president kept stalling the White House. It wasn't until April of that year that they agreed to do it. The first plan that the White House rolled out, their plan was to hold 5 fundraisers in Texas. 5 fundraisers. And Governor Connally says, no. He told Nellie that if people could see the president in the right circumstances, they would like him. And that was the thinking he had strategically to plan. He said, we're not going to do that. He said, you don't want to come down here and look like you're raping the state for money. That was the conversation. So they finally relented. We ended up with 4 non-political events. The only political event was Austin, the last day, of course, which never happened. All the rest of them are bipartisan events put on by chambers of commerce, or one of them at the Air Force Base in San Antonio that Stephen mentioned. But that was the background. So it was not about political. Now, we had political problems in Texas. In those days, it may be hard for you all to remember in the days of Republican domination today, but in those days, this was a Democratic state, very solidly Democratic. But there were 2 factions of the Democratic Party. There was a conservative wing led more by Governor Connally and Vice President Johnson, and there was the liberal wing, and one of the great leaders of that party was Senator Ralph Yarborough. So they fought in the primaries. But they came together in the general election. In fact, if you remember, if Texas had not been carried for the president, he would never have been president. Texas was the difference. The votes from Texas made the difference in him being president. So if Johnson hadn't been on the ticket, he would have never been president. So although there was political division, that was not the primary reason for the trip to Texas. Now, it accomplished both, however. There wasn't any question that a visit, particularly with the First Lady on board, was going to help them politically. There's no question about that, and Governor Connally knew that, but he wanted to reach all the people that weren't for him. That was his whole strategy, and that's why we did it that way.
Now, you joined the party in Fort Worth on the evening of November 21st.
That's right.
And you spent a little time with Governor Connally that evening and some reporters. Tell us about what was the nature of your conversation? What was the outlook towards Friday?
Well, we were anticipating, of course. I was in my hometown. I lived in Fort Worth then. He was from home. He was from Fort Worth. Governor Connally was in Fort Worth before he was governor. And they, of course, came in. They had been to San Antonio. They'd had huge crowds in San Antonio that day. They'd gone into Houston that afternoon for a big dinner honoring Congressman Thomas, who was head of the Appropriations Committee in Congress, a very important factor. Then they flew into Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth late that evening, maybe 11 o'clock, 11:30, but just before midnight. There were crowds along the street, even though that late hour, all the way in from Carswell Air Force Base to downtown, Hotel Texas, the old Hotel Texas, which today is the Hilton Texas Hotel. So there's a big crowd there. So obviously everybody was high in spirits. And so after the president, First Lady went upstairs to go to bed, Governor Connally held court in the coffee shop downstairs, and reporters were all around him, and everybody was happy, buoyant, everybody looking up to tomorrow. And so we were all joyous. We couldn't wait till the next morning. That was the background of what the mood was.
And the next morning, you were there for that. We're looking at a picture of President Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Governor Connally, Jim Wright, Ralph Yarborough, all coming out of the Hotel Texas. There was a speech in the parking lot and then a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. Give us an overview of your experiences that morning.
Every time I think about it, I get excited again. This was before the sadness. So you have to think and understand that this was a buoyant spirit for all of us. This is something that everybody was so pleased about. It was misting rain that morning. If you looked at the pictures that are published, there are people in rain hats and raincoats. In fact, some of the people coming out, a couple, three of them you see with raincoats, the president did not wear one. But this was an added event. Originally, the Chamber of Commerce breakfast was the key of the day, okay? But they could only seat about 2,500 to 3,000 people. And most of the people were Chamber of Commerce members or civic leaders. The general public that were for Kennedy, I'm talking about good Democrats, unquote, couldn't get in. So they added this event across the street for him to come out and speak. That's what you see the picture of there. And there were 5,000 people out on that parking lot. 5,000 people in a misty rain. And nobody could believe it. I mean, it was just, there are thousands of pictures of this from different directions. You can see the mobs. So I went out there. I was out there, of course, with everybody else. And then, of course, we went back inside. You've seen footage of his making the speech. It was a buoyant time. Went back inside for the breakfast itself. That was wonderful. Mrs. Kennedy made a late arrangement. I was sitting at the back of the room with Liz Carpenter, standing in the back of the room against the back wall. Liz Carpenter, who was the First Lady's, she was not the First Lady. I keep getting ahead of myself. Mrs. Johnson's press person, and a great historian in her own right. And she was standing in the back room with me, and she said, "You think she's going to show up?" I said, "Oh, yes, she's going to make her own grand entrance." And that's exactly what she did, and the crowd went crazy when she walked in the door. So it was one of those buoyant moments. Originally, Stephen, as you know, I was planning to go back to Austin after that event because I was supposed to write some remarks for the governor for that night of introducing the president. We had other stuff prepared, but just to add remarks along the way. And I got caught up about the time we walked back into the hotel. The clouds parted, it came out. It was like a fall day. It's beautiful blue sky, and the sun coming out. And I thought, oh man, this is too great. I'm not going to miss Dallas. I'm going to go to Dallas. I knew I could get to Austin later and write those remarks. So I jumped on the bus with all the press to go out to Carswell and got on the charter airplane and flew to Love Field. Took 14 minutes to make that flight. You can believe that. From Carswell to Love Field, not DFW. There was no DFW in those days. So all on board, we had all the leading press people from the White House, more than 55 or 60 of them. If you look in the book, he's talking about, in the back of the book, I have included an itinerary from the White House of that trip. I'm also listed in there a manifest of every person who was on board of Air Force One, and all members of the press from the White House were on the press plane, the charter that followed it. That's all in the book. And if you look at it, it's a who's who of all the famous names you've read about for the last 50 years from the press corps. So we all flew over there, got out and got in these buses. We had 2 buses, actually, 2 chartered buses with a sign on the side, your pictures of that you have here, White House Press. So that's how I happened to be here at that moment in history.
We're looking at a picture of the Kennedys at Love Field. That was an impromptu greeting. It was not scheduled.
That's correct. The president got so carried away himself that he left the Secret Service detail, and if you all know what's happened on these trips, they went nuts. You know, they didn't want him doing this. So, but he did it, and that captures it better than I ever can. That was a spirit that existed at Love Field as he got into that motorcade, got into the limousine, and I got into that bus.
Well, here's a picture of your bus, White House Press. Now,
there you are.
This is important for your account of the assassination. Where were you seated on the bus?
I was seated in the front of the bus on the right front seat. If you remember buses, I guess they still do, they have a flat seat up at the front, you know, that's about the size of about 3 seats, flat against the wall. I was sitting just across from the driver in that seat because I, along with an assistant press secretary on the bus, we were kind of in charge of the bus. The fact that I was on it, naturally, I was there hosting the press again for Connally. So I just took that seat in the front. And it just happened, we were about the 6th or 7th vehicle in the motorcade. We were coming down Main Street. You got 3 major seats, as you know, streets. Main Street was the one we were coming down from Love Field. So I was sitting in that right front seat, and as we turned the corner from Main Street to Houston, 1 block, y'all look at the geography around here, 1 block, I was sitting in that seat just as the limousine made the turn and went under the window of the building. So I just happened to have, like you're sitting over there, I just happened to have a natural view of that limousine. I wasn't moving. I would just happen to be looking that way. And everybody on the bus was happy, a lot of banter going on. The press was amazed with what had happened on the trip. They couldn't wait to learn more, to get on to the rest of the trip. And all of a sudden, pop, pop, pop. And we didn't know what had happened. Remember, no cell phones. I looked down across the scene. I saw the limousine stop for a moment and then lurch forward. At the same time, I thought maybe it was a backfire, but then I saw parents throwing their children down on the ground, covering them up on both sides of the street, and I saw motorcyclists scurrying up the grassy knoll. So we knew something terrible had happened. Obviously, we did not know that the president had been killed or about dead, but we knew something terrible had happened and that limousine would not be racing off. So we had to decide, what do we do with the bus? We didn't know where they'd gone, but we figured something bad had happened. So we quickly made the decision to go on to the Trade Mart out on Stemmons Avenue, as you know, not that far away, only about a mile or so from where we were. So we took the bus out there. I jumped off the bus. The press jumped off. I jumped off first at the front seat. They jumped off and ran for a bank of pay phones. In public buildings in those days, remember, there were whole banks of pay phones because all of them were scurrying to try to find out what happened. They ran to that. I ran up to the front, the podium, where Mr. Eric Johnson became mayor of Dallas after that, but at that time he was chairman of the luncheon. He was head of one of the sponsors of the luncheon, the Citizens League here in Dallas, political group, non-conservative, but they weren't politicking this day. Anyway, I ran up to him. First of all, though, I have to tell you, when I ran into that hall, it was eerie. 3,000 people, the banter in that hall of anticipation. They think the president and first lady are going to walk in any moment. And I thought, my God, they don't have any idea of what has happened. But I ran up to him, and he was on a podium up above me. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Johnson, we think something terrible has happened. We don't know for sure what, but we think maybe the president has been shot and Governor Conley's been shot. And he just stared down at me, just in disbelief for a minute. It seemed like forever. And he turned and called for a prayer. He said, well, I think we'll wait a while and find out more before we decide what to do. I rushed out of the building, ran outside. I wanted to find Ms. Connally and Governor Connally. So I assumed in my mind maybe they had gone to a hospital nearby. And Parkland was a trauma hospital. That's where all the trauma cases went. Ran outside and had the lucky break of running into a friend of mine from Fort Worth, a lady who was coming to luncheon. And I quickly commandeered her car, and she raced me over to Parkland Hospital. And I got over there, and I'll never forget the feeling over there. I jumped out of the bus and her car, and ran straight to the end door of Parkland Hospital. Nobody there. Not a soul. Door open, pulled the door open, walked in. No security of any kind. Unbelievable. I quickly found a nurse and asked her if she'd take me to Ms. Connally, because I knew I was looking for her. I figured she'd be with the First Lady as well. She quickly took me to find them in a dark hallway. And I will never, ever, ever forget that picture. 2 women, one on one side in front of Trauma Room 1, the First Lady, and across the hall, Nettie Connally, outside Trauma Room 2. 2 women, totally alone, praying that their husbands would survive. I felt very out of place, very awkward to be there. But I knew that the press would be scrambling around, wanting to know what had happened in that limousine. Miss Connally was calm. She was very glad to see anybody. I said, I'd like to know what happened inside the limousine. Remember, everybody knows it now, but such interesting things, or basic things such as how were they seated? Nobody knew that. So we quickly talked, and I sketched out of a little piece of paper the seating arrangement. And that's what you're seeing, or you have seen it. Do we have that? Are we showing that?
Oh, yeah, the video in just a moment, yeah.
Yeah.
But Malcolm Kilduff, the Assistant White House Press Secretary, he spoke before you. We're looking at a picture of him right now.
Okay. I went to find Malcolm quickly to set up a temporary press room in the hospital. And so we scrambled around to put this press room together, and the media by then were all there and were descending on us. They didn't know what had happened. But then Malcolm Kilduff came out.
Right. And he delivered the news that the president
He delivered the news about 30 minutes after we got there that the president was dead. And the picture, you have that picture, I think.
Yeah. It's
one of the most incredible photos of this entire tragedy. Look at the faces of those newsmen, these hard, bitter newsmen. Look at those faces. I think this says it better than you can say it with words. It's an incredible, incredible picture. So immediately after he finished, I got up and gave a briefing.
Yeah, and we have that video. So let's take a look at Julian Reed right after the announcement of the president's death at Parkland Hospital.
I'm Julian Reed, R-E-A-D, aide to Governor Connally.
Could you describe the seating position in the automobile?
Yes. The president was seated in the right rear seat. Opposite in the left rear was Mrs. Kennedy. Immediately ahead of the president on a jump seat was Governor Connally. Immediately opposite him was Mrs. Connally. Farther up, of course, we had Secret Service, as you know. As Mrs. Connally recalls, just before they reached the triple underpass, the shot rang out, the first shot, and she feels quite sure that it did hit the president. Governor Connally, who was seated here, turned immediately to see what happened, and as he turned, he was struck. The president, according to Mrs. Connally, immediately slumped, and Mrs. Kennedy grabbed him. A moment later, Governor Connally slumped, and Mrs. Connally grabbed him. Both women grabbed the men almost simultaneously and ducked as much as possible to guard against any possible gunfire following that. Mrs. Connally says that the next thing she recalls is a Secret Service man picking up a telephone in the car and giving instructions of, let's proceed direct to the nearest hospital.
Extraordinary. And when I look at that, I see a young man in the midst of an unenviable situation with the entire world hanging on your words. What was this like for you emotionally? Here, your friend, John Connally, has been gravely wounded, possibly dying, and yet you have to do your job as press aide. What was that like for you?
Well, I was in shock, and I've been asked many times, how did you do that? And my answer is, I was on autopilot. As a former newsman, a reporter, it was all instinctive. It just came to me. It's not how I planned it, There was just an obvious need to do it. Somebody had to do it. And as I said, I was on automatic pilot. It wasn't until about 3 days later that it really soaked in on me what had happened and what I did. Because I spent 2 nights and 3 days in Parkland Hospital before I ever went home. Didn't leave there. So, as I said, initially it was just automatic response without really realizing what I was doing. And years later, I didn't know this clip existed until last year when I decided to write this book. And I found it on Google. YouTube on Google, which is the greatest tool ever came along for a writer, I'll tell you that, or anything else. But that's the truth. Amazing.
Now, while Governor Connally was recovering at Parkland, you helped to set up a temporary office of the governor from his hospital room.
That's correct.
And you also organized press conferences for Mrs. Connally and then a bedside interview for Governor Connally. What was this like in the aftermath of the assassination, dealing with the press?
Well, after I did the briefing that you just saw, that afternoon I orchestrated a briefing by Dr. Shaw, who was a surgeon who saved Governor Connally's life. Governor Connally, it's so sad, I've thought of it many times. Any other time in world history, the governor of Texas had been almost killed. That would be the 8-column headline, right? It just so happened that was the same moment that the President of the United States was killed. So the stories about John Connally were down here on the bottom of the page. Understandably, that was appropriate. But at the same time, all the people who knew Governor Connally and the supporters all across Texas were in shock. It wasn't they didn't appreciate the sadness about Kennedy, but they were worried about John and Nellie Connally. So this office you talked about, we were besieged. Thousands of phone calls. We had hundreds of people flocking in from all over the state in the hospital. We couldn't tell them anything much, but they wanted to see somebody. They wanted to see somebody, and how are John and Nellie? So we dealt with that for days and days and days. On the press side, one thing I would mention that I think is interesting, after I dealt with all the press at the event itself that day, about midnight of that same day, I'll never forget this, here comes another whole wave of newsmen, people I'd never seen, and all of them had foreign accents. They were from Europe, most of them. It was as quick as they could get to Dallas after the assassination. A whole new wave of journalists, which demonstrates how well Kennedy was known around the world. So I spent till about 2 o'clock in the morning dealing with those people. But then, as you mentioned, I did another thing. We had Mrs. Connally speak to the press on Sunday morning. This was Friday, when the assassination. On Sunday morning, about mid-morning, I guess, or late, mid-9 or 10 o'clock, or maybe 10:30, we had a press briefing from her. She was very brave. She read a statement, expressing one of the things that always touched me. They were getting so many flowers, they had no room for them, you can imagine. The rooms were full of flowers. And she said she would hope that people who wanted to help, that they would instead give money to Mrs. Tippit, the widow of the policeman who was killed by Oswald. You remember that part of the story? She asked, would you please make donations to her to help her in the memory of her husband. I thought that was very sweet. That was her idea. It was not a writer. I didn't do it. But we dealt with that. Then, as you say, Governor Connally, after the funeral, the press came to me and said, the piece of the story that's still incomplete is hearing from Governor Connally. We'd like to hear from Governor Connally. Well, he was still very weak. You know, he had his arm hung up overhead and he still had tubes in it. And so I wasn't going to put him out there for a press conference. So I came up with the idea of having one reporter be a pool reporter for the world. That was very unusual. Nobody had done it at that stage. But that was the only condition we put on it. We told there were only 3 networks. This will give you a little time warp to think about. In today's where you've got a list 18 miles long of every cable under in the free world and beyond, there were 3 networks. That was it in national television. NBC, ABC, and CBS. We selected one reporter, a reporter for Martin Agronsky, who was a star reporter for NBC. I had dealt with him. I knew he was a reliable guy you could count on, and I asked NBC to use him. He was at Arlington Cemetery at Kennedy's grave when they found him before midnight that night. They flew him on the red eye to Dallas. He slept a few hours that morning, and we did the bedside interview with the conditions that, A, it would be at 4:15 p.m. Texas time. The network would take the entire interview, 15-minute interview, in full with no editing. And NBC, ABC, they were okay with. CBS sent me a telegram objecting violently. And I understood that, but we had to do it that way. And to their credit, all 3 networks ran the story in full without editing. So that was a high point of his reaching out. And the important thing that came out of this, at that time, we still didn't know whether there was an international coup or a conspiracy of some type, and the country was nervous. They didn't know Johnson. Outside of Texas, nobody knew him, despite his distinguished career in the Senate. So there was a lot of nervousness in this country. One of the things that Gronsky asked him, well, what's your view of Lyndon Johnson, who then is the President of the United States? And among other things he said, I know of no man in this hour of tragedy and uncertainty. I know of no man I would rather have dealing my hand than Lyndon B. Johnson. And that was credited with having a lot of a calming effect on the country and giving some reassurance to people who didn't know him. So that was the major thing that came out of that interview.
I want to jump ahead now, 30 years in fact. Governor Connally passes away in 1993, and that same year, in November, Dealey Plaza, this site was named a National Historic Landmark District, and Nellie Connally agreed to be a special guest on that occasion, and you arranged that. Tell us about that.
That's right. Well, of course, Mrs. Connally, she had been obviously a part of this story from the beginning, you know. And in 1993, when you all came up with the plan to dedicate Dealey Plaza, she was a natural one to turn to since she was a participant. And so I was very happy to help do what I could just to support it. And I did indeed help her, you know, and it was a great event. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, that was the first oral history you did with Mrs. Connally. Do you remember that?
Well, I wasn't here in 93.
I thought you did that.
I was here in 2003.
I thought you did. Yeah, okay. I thought
it's a lot of anniversaries.
Yes, a lot. Anyway, she did while she was here. She did the first oral history that she had done. So
let's talk about Mrs. Connally for a second, because while he was alive, Governor Connally was the one that everyone wanted to hear from. But she began doing interviews after his death, and she was, for many around the world, the last link to that motorcade, the last survivor of that motorcade.
That's right.
And you traveled with her and were there when she did a number of interviews, such as Larry King. And
that's right.
What was that like for her in the last years of her life?
Well, interesting you'd bring that up, because I love Nettie Connolly. I mean, I literally love Nettie Connolly. She was a graceful, smart, funny lady. And I love working with her. It was just, I can't tell you how great it was. First of all, you need to know that after they came back to Austin, after he got out of the hospital, 10 days later, she sat down with a legal pad, yellow pad, and wrote out in longhand her memories of what she had witnessed in the last 2 weeks. It was 20-something, I think, or maybe 30 pages longhand. Legal pad, put it in a file cabinet, and forgot it. Literally forgot it for years. Now, she would be interviewed like Governor Connally was on anniversary dates, but those notes she put away. And 30 years later, how many years later, she was messing around in there one day and found those notes. And she looked at them, she told me, she says, you know, this is pretty complete. She was surprised about what all she had captured in that moment of horror. So that became the basis for her book. And these notes we talked about on the Larry King Show. And after that, we got a call from a publisher in New York, an agent for a publisher, and he said, there's a book here. I want to do a book with you. And long story short, we did. She did her own book. And then we had enormous response to it. And we had book signings, went from L.A. to New York. We kicked it off in New York, and we had everybody from Walter Cronkite to Barbara Walters there in person to greet her, to launch the book. So it turned into a really big deal. It was a wonderful thing because it allowed Ms. Connally to go back to UT. After she saw John Connally, they worked together in drama. She loved to act. In fact, she was a natural. But because she respected John Connally's political career, she stayed behind the scenes. She never really got out front. And so this gave her time, sort of, to blossom in terms of being a personality, which I think was wonderful for her. And I watched her, the last years of her life, grow in her own right to become a personality that had never had a chance to be out there, so to speak. So I think it was wonderful and very gratifying for me personally.
And you have now written your own book, JFK's Final Hours in Texas. And in the book, you recount the story you told us today, but you also talk about the legacy of the assassination. And you talk quite a bit about the 50th anniversary, the half-century mark. And I'd like, now that we're past the 50th, I'd like you to comment on what you think about how Texas as a whole responded to this very important moment in history.
Well, I think it's very, very gratifying to me because I was part of that so long ago. I think the way the legacy of that event, there are two pieces of a legacy of that event. Talk about a little bit about the historical legacy of the event. Most people don't realize or think about what all occurred after that. Because of the assassination, think in terms of history, the country was moving toward doing something more about segregation and all the side effects of that. Civil rights. President Kennedy was very dedicated to civil rights. He had pushed for a Civil Rights Act. There had been a piece of it passed, but at the same time it was stalled. A lot of senators in the South fought it. Even people in the North were dug in their heels. It wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, Lyndon Johnson, who was master of the Senate, was vice president, and he was sort of sidelined by the White House. The president got along okay with Johnson, but the staff did not like him. Bobby Kennedy, I will say a little stronger than that, did not like him. Okay? So the genius of Johnson was sidelined. So there's where we were. Johnson always had the passion for civil rights. He really had more passion for it than Kennedy because he had, as a young teacher in Cotulla, Texas, he taught young Mexicans Americans. There are pictures, a photograph of him standing in the back of a crowd in that school. It is very, very touching. He saw the plight of people who needed to have more opportunity. So he had already had this vision for years, but he had no place to go with it. The assassination changed all that overnight. All of a sudden, you had the combination of a martyred president, a martyrdom. Everybody in the country, tragically, grieving over his death. And you had Johnson, all of a sudden, had the power. He knew he had to move quickly, and he did so. And in 1965, in early 1965, we had the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act moving forward, and was passed. Ironically, it took both. Johnson couldn't have done that by himself, and Kennedy couldn't do it by himself. It took both to make that happen. I think that is the overriding legacy of the assassination. Now, fast forward, as we were talking about here, Stephen's asked, about where we were on the 50th anniversary. Of course, the sixth floor museum is a centerpiece of everything. That's obvious. And the things that everybody knew what was going to happen here. But a lot of other pieces all came together. First of all, Mayor Rollins here in Dallas was very wise to anticipate this 50th anniversary. And he wanted to make sure that it wasn't taken over by the conspiracist people to make a spectacle of it on the 50th anniversary, because they'd been coming out of the woodwork for years with a new movie or a new show with another piece of, history, okay? So he took the right action of appointing a blue ribbon committee of Dallas people to plan what he called an appropriate ceremony, observance. They came up with the idea of a very simple ceremony in Dealey Plaza, no longer than 1 hour, and that's what they did. And all of you have read about it or know about it. It was beautifully done. It, in combination with what's done here at the museum, kind of set the tone for it. Well, that was beautiful in itself, and that was televised, of course, around the world. It was a beautiful thing. The author, historian that spoke.
David McCullough.
David McCullough presented the major address, and of course that gave credibility, enormous credibility to it right there. So it was a beautiful ceremony. It all came off without a hitch at all. So that was part of it, but that was just the beginning, because other elements popped up organically around the state. In Fort Worth, where I told you about the happy times, in Fort Worth, they created a JFK Memorial Plaza on that vacant lot I told you about across the street from the Hotel Texas, featuring an 8-foot beautiful bronze of Kennedy and a lovely backdrop murals of that morning in that lot. That's a beautiful piece. That was done by the Downtown Fort Worth Inc., along with historians in Fort Worth. That's a piece of what I call, there was a tapestry that developed organically. There was no master plan. It just happened. At the same time, the Chamber of Commerce of Fort Worth restaged the breakfast that was glorious breakfast of that day. They had another Chamber of Commerce breakfast. The Amon Carter Museum had a special showing, along with the Dallas Museum of Art, of all of the fine art that hung in the suite the last night Kennedy slept. There was this magnificent collection of art that was installed in their suite because it was a drab suite, and the arts community just couldn't stand the idea of the President First Lady being in this ugly suite. So they collected all this incredible world-level art and hung it in there like a museum. That was brought in. 13 of 15 pieces of that collection was recaptured and put up for another exhibit. So that was more of the tapestry I'm talking about. Arlington, UTSA Arlington had an exhibit of photographs. The library in Fort Worth had an incredible exhibit of photos. In Austin, the LBJ Library put in a whole new section, brought it up to date with more attention to the history of that time. And even in San Antonio, where he first spoke on that trip, a craftsman on that base had created this magnificent fine wood podium, created just for that one speech. And afterward, the podium kind of got lost. It was kicked around the community, arguments about who was going to own it, and it went into a storeroom somewhere. But for the 50th anniversary, it was taken out of the storage and was exhibited as a feature attraction at the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. So all I say here is all these pieces emerged, and I think it ended up being a beautiful tapestry for Texas to honor Kennedy. Whatever you thought of him politically, it came together, and to me it was personally very gratifying, and I think it allowed all of Dallas, certainly, Fort Worth, the whole state, to come to peace, a reconciliation with history that I think is an enormous asset and a great legacy for the event.
Well, let's take a few audience questions. If you have questions for Julian Reed, if you'll pass them to the end of your rows, we'll go through a few of these. I have some that were already given to me, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is one I knew would come up. Did Governor Connally believe in the single bullet theory?
No.
Okay.
But he was wrong. Well, he's always felt like that he was sitting in front, as you saw on the picture. He always felt like that he didn't get hit by the first shot because he turned. He is a punter, and so he turned and he felt like he couldn't have done that. Well, of course, ultimately we showed that science has proven that one bullet hit Kennedy and him. There's no question about it. But he never could come to peace on it.
But even though he didn't believe in the single bullet theory, he also believed that Oswald acted alone.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, he did. He always believed that. He didn't believe any of these conspiracy theories. And in fact, he was questioned about every time for months. Every year we'd do press conferences to talk about this. And he always got that question. And he had a great answer. He said, nobody could keep a secret that long. If there was something else, if there'd been something else happen or somebody else was behind him, and I'm convinced totally that it was him and him alone, just a crazy guy.
Did President Kennedy make the decision to remove the bubble top on the motorcade?
I don't know. I think it was probably a combination of factors. I'm assuming he certainly had to approve it, but I'm sure that his handlers, they're thinking politically, you know. They obviously would much rather have him exposed to the public. That's the best benefit of a public trip for an elected official. So I think it was a combination. But it obviously, the weather was the major factor, you know. That was really the deciding vote, was the weather. It turned off so beautifully, and the trip, all the reception they also had, they had the experience of what had already occurred in Fort Worth. Mm-hmm. So that gave them confidence, and they just wanted to have more exposure.
What did Governor Connally think of the sixth floor museum? It's a good question.
Well, I think he thought it was a wonderful thing. I'm trying to think of the geography, the time factor.
The museum opened in '89. He passed away in '93.
Right. Okay, so he certainly was aware, yes, and was here to see it. As I remember, he always thought it was a good thing.
Okay.
I don't know that he ever was that much involved in it, you know, mm-hmm. But certainly he and Nellie both thought it was a wonderful thing.
Well, I know Mrs. Connally did come.
Oh, yeah, she's been here, as you know, several times.
Was there a feeling of guilt in Texas after the assassination?
Well, that's a whole nother program.
Yeah. Briefly.
Yes. I think there was. More importantly, though, there was a very heavy and bitter feeling about guilt of Texas from outside Texas. What Dallas lived with for decades is horrible. Dallas was a center of hate for people outside of Dallas. Things happened on that period following that you cannot believe. The people of Dallas wanted to forget about it, period. This building was almost torn down. This was almost bulldozed several times. But Dallasites traveling outside of Dallas were treated bitterly. The leader of Dallas, head of the largest foundation here, was literally thrown out of a taxi cab in New York when the driver learned he was from Dallas. People traveling outside of Dallas were refused services in a restaurant or a hotel. It was that bad. It was really, really bad. So Dallas wanted to forget it. That's why it took so long to get the movement here by enlightened people to do an exhibit. That's another whole story. But outside people felt terrible about Dallas. And ironically, this is a side note, but it's very interesting. The two events that were credited by a lot of people, including public figures, of what changed Dallas' image, the image of Dallas from being the hate city, unquote, were the Dallas Cowboys and the television show Dallas. Because people started talking more about Dallas and the Cowboys. Roger Staubach was Mr. God for all those years they were running championships. You're not a football fan, believe me. This was a big deal around the world. I had a reporter tell me, are y'all familiar with the show Dallas? Any of y'all used to watch Dallas, a soap opera, on at night? Well, the family, what's the name of the family? The
Ewings.
Yeah, the Ewing family. A reporter told me, one of the interviews I did, a reporter told me that he traveled to London several years after when the show was in full bloom, and this guy over there, an educated leader over there, asked him very casually, said, I know you're a reporter from Dallas. Do you know the Ewings personally?
We have time for just one more question. Did Governor Connally ever express any concerns for the president's safety?
As for his safety?
Yeah.
No, he did not. You got to remember, this was still the age of innocence, basically. You know, we didn't have security everywhere. Governor Connally and I, there's also a question I lied with that, is been asked many times, was Oswald really after him rather than the president? Hit the wrong person. And all those questions, Connally would say, well, I was available any day. He could find me on the streets of Austin. Well, that was true. So I think the same confidence he had, plus he knew the Secret Service had, good Lord, for security. So I don't think he ever had that much apprehension. Stanley Marcus, legendary merchant here, Stanley Marcus, the name of the department store, he warned the president not to come to Dallas. He did not want him to come to Dallas. But obviously the president didn't pay attention to that.
Well, that's all the time we have, but Julian Reed is going to be over at that table. He'll be glad to meet you and sign a copy of his book. I'll be around if you have a copy of my book that you'd like signed, and I hope you will now join me in thanking Julian Reed for being here with us today.